Let's get into something uncomfortable today, something most people in this space dance around because it feels harsh, because it feels like vilifying someone who is, at their core, acting from a place of fear and old wounds rather than malice. But here's the thing. Understanding someone's why doesn't mean you stop being honest about what their behavior is doing to you. And today we need to be honest, because one of the most consistent, most damaging patterns in relationships with avoidance is gaslighting. Not always conscious, not always cruel in intent, but real. And if you've been in or around an avoidant relationship for any length of time, there is a very good chance you've experienced it. And there is an equally good chance you spend months, maybe longer, wondering if you imagined the whole thing. You didn't. And today we're going to talk about why. First, let's be clear about what gaslighting actually is, because this word gets used a lot, and it needs to mean something specific for this conversation to land properly. Gaslighting is not just lying. It's not just someone saying something untrue. Gaslighting is when someone's behavior or words consistently make you doubt your own perception of reality, your own feelings, your own memory of events, your own sense of what is and isn't reasonable to need. It's the experience of knowing something happened and having the other person look you in the eye and make you feel like you invented it, or exaggerated it, or misunderstood it, or made it mean something it didn't mean. And over time, this is the part that's really important. Over time, gaslighting doesn't just make you doubt specific incidents. It makes you doubt yourself as a reliable narrator of your own experience. It erodes your trust in your own instincts. And once your instincts are compromised, once you've stopped trusting what you feel and perceive, you become significantly easier to manage. Significantly easier to keep at arm's length, significantly easier to hold in a dynamic that serves the other person without fully serving you. Now, why are avoidants particularly prone to this pattern? That's what we're going to get into. The specific way avoidants are built for this. Now, before we get into the mechanics of how this plays out, I want to acknowledge something. Because I think it's important, most avoidants are not sitting in a room somewhere consciously plotting how to make you doubt yourself. Most of them are not calculating. Most of them genuinely believe, at least in the moment, that their version of events is accurate, that you are overreacting, that the conversation didn't go the way you remember, that what they said wasn't that bad, that your needs really are excessive. And that distinction matters, not because it makes the impact on you any less real. It doesn't. But because understanding that the gaslighting is often genuinely unconscious, that it comes from their own distorted relationship with emotional reality rather than from deliberate manipulation, helps you understand why it's so hard to call out, why it's so hard to address, why you often leave those conversations more confused than when you started. When someone is lying, there's a deliberateness to it that you can eventually sense. But when someone genuinely believes their distorted version of events, when their avoidance is so deeply wired that they've convinced themselves that your reactions are the problem rather than the behavior causing them, you're not arguing with a liar. You're arguing with someone whose entire emotional architecture depends on not seeing what you're asking them to see. That's a much harder conversation to have, and it's a much harder pattern to escape, because it doesn't feel like abuse, it doesn't feel like manipulation. It just feels like a constant, exhausting, low-grade sense that you and this person are living in slightly different versions of reality, and you can never quite get them to inhabit yours. Let that be clear in your mind as we go deeper. The avoidance relationship with their own reality. Here's something that took me a long time to understand about avoidant attachment, and I think it's the key to everything we're going to talk about today. Avoidants don't just avoid emotional intimacy with other people, they avoid emotional intimacy with themselves. They have spent so long disconnecting from their own feelings, learning to not need, not want, not depend, not feel too much, that they have a genuinely limited relationship with their own inner experience. They don't fully know what they feel. They don't fully know what they want. And when strong emotions do arise, which they do because they're human, because emotions don't actually disappear just because you stop acknowledging them, avoidants often experience them as threatening, uncomfortable, unwanted, something to manage, something to minimize, something to make go away. And so when you come to them with something emotionally real, when you name something that happened, when you share how you felt, when you identify a pattern that's causing you pain, they don't just dismiss your experience. They have to dismiss it. Because acknowledging your experience would mean acknowledging their own. And their own is the last place they want to go. This is where the gaslighting begins. Not because they've decided to manipulate you, but because the alternative, fully sitting with the emotional reality of what's happening between you, is something their system genuinely cannot do yet. Minimizing your experience is, for them, a form of self-protection. The fact that it's doing serious damage to you in the process is something they either can't see or can't fully hold. And none of that makes it okay. Sit with that too. The most common gaslighting patterns in avoidant relationships. Let me get specific, because I want you to recognize these. I want you to hear them and feel the recognition of, yes, that. That's what happened. The first one is the "you're too sensitive" response. You express something that hurt you. You do it calmly, carefully, specifically. And they look at you with what might even be genuine confusion and tell you that you're overreacting, that you're reading into things, that they didn't mean it like that most people wouldn't have a problem with what they did. And you leave that conversation not talking about the original thing anymore. You leave it defending your right to have been hurt, which means the actual issue never gets addressed. And you walk away feeling like the problem in the room. The second pattern is the memory manipulation. You remember clearly that they said something, did something, agreed to something, and when you bring it up, they tell you that's not what happened. Not exactly, anyway. They reframe it, revise it, add context that changes the meaning until your version and their version are so different that you start wondering if your memory is reliable. And because they seem so certain, and because you're already conditioned to doubt yourself in this relationship, you start to accept their version, even when something in you knows it isn't right. The third pattern is what I'd call the moving goalpost. Every time you try to identify a pattern, every time you say you always do this or this keeps happening, they find the exception. The one time they didn't do it, the time things went differently. And suddenly the conversation is about that exception instead of the pattern. And the pattern never gets acknowledged because there's always a counterexample available to derail the discussion. The fourth pattern, and this one is subtle, is the emotional minimization loop. You express a feeling, they acknowledge it briefly, maybe with something like, "I hear you," or "I didn't mean to upset you," and then nothing changes. The next time it happens, you bring it up again. They do the same thing, acknowledge, briefly, move on, and over time you stop bringing it up because it feels pointless, and the silence gets mistaken for resolution. Nothing was actually resolved. You just got tired of raising it. Any of those sound familiar? If they do, stay with me, because there's more to understand here. The cycle that keeps you in it. Here's something most people don't realize until they're out of it. The gaslighting in an avoidant relationship doesn't just make you doubt yourself. It actively keeps you in the dynamic. And I want to explain exactly how that works, because understanding the mechanism is part of breaking free from it. When your reality is consistently undermined, you don't just accept it and move on. You work harder to get it validated. That's a natural human response. If someone dismisses what you felt, you don't just drop it. You try to explain it better, more clearly, with more evidence, with a calmer tone. You try to find the version of the conversation that will finally make them see what you're saying. And in doing that, in working harder and harder to get your experience acknowledged, you actually deepen your investment in the relationship. Not because the relationship is working, but because unresolved injustice keeps you tied to the source. You can't leave a conversation that never reached a resolution. You can't walk away from a version of events that was never corrected. The incompleteness keeps you there, reaching for the acknowledgement that would let you finally put it down. This is not weakness. This is the psychology of unresolved experience. It is built into how human beings process their interactions with other people, and avoidants, again, often without realizing it, benefit from this cycle. Because the more you're focused on getting them to validate your experience, the more present you are in their orbit, the more available you are, the more the dynamic continues on their terms. The way out of this cycle is not winning the argument. The way out is deciding that you don't need their acknowledgement to move forward, that your experience can be real and valid without their agreement, that you can close a chapter even if the other person refuses to read it. That's one of the hardest things a person can learn to do, but it is absolutely learnable. What this does to your sense of self. I want to talk about what consistent gaslighting, even unintentional gaslighting, does to a person over time. Because I think a lot of people listening to this are carrying damage they don't fully recognize as damage. When your perceptions and feelings are consistently minimized, questioned, or revised, When the person you're closest to regularly implies or outright tells you that your version of events is wrong, you start to build a quiet belief. And that belief is, I can't trust myself. It doesn't announce itself like that. It arrives in smaller forms. You stop speaking up about things because you've learned your concerns will be redirected. You start pre-apologizing for your own emotional reactions because you've been trained to see them as the problem. You spend enormous energy moderating yourself, checking yourself before you say something, asking yourself if your reaction is reasonable, wondering if you're being too much. When in reality, none of that self-monitoring was ever necessary. Your reactions were reasonable. Your feelings were valid. Your memory was accurate. You were not the problem, but you've been living as though you were. And that belief, that quiet belief that you can't trust your own experience, is one of the most insidious things gaslighting leaves behind, because it persists long after the relationship does. People come out of avoidant relationships, even relationships that were never formally defined as relationships, and they don't fully trust themselves. They don't trust their reads on other people. They second-guess their instincts. They wonder if they're overreacting before they even react. They apologize for having needs before anyone has told them their needs are a problem. That's the residue. That's what needs to be specifically, deliberately healed. What avoidants often say, that sounds like accountability but isn't. I want to add something here that a lot of people find confusing, because avoidants are not always dismissive. They're not always defensive. Sometimes, especially when they can feel you pulling away, or when the relationship feels threatened, they can actually say things that sound remarkably like accountability. They'll say, I know I have walls up, I'm working on it. They'll say, I know I shut down sometimes, I'm sorry. They'll say, I know you need more than I've been giving, I'm trying. And in those moments, something in you exhales, because it sounds like they see it. It sounds like the acknowledgement you've been waiting for is finally arriving. But here's what I want you to pay attention to. Watch what happens after those moments. Does the behavior change? Does the pattern actually shift? Or does the acknowledgement come, and then a few days later it's back to the same dynamic, the same distance, the same minimizing of your experience when you bring something up? Because acknowledgement without change is not accountability. Acknowledgement without change is a pressure valve. It's a way of releasing enough tension to keep the dynamic going without actually addressing the thing that created the tension. And in an avoidant relationship, those pressure valve moments can keep you in place for years. Because every time you're on the verge of a real reckoning, the words arrive just in time to give you enough hope to stay. Real accountability looks like different behavior over time. Not one vulnerable conversation, not a beautiful moment of self-awareness, an actual sustained shift in how they show up. A pattern change, not a pattern pause. And if the pattern keeps returning despite the acknowledgements, that's information. Important information about what you can actually expect going forward. Why you need to trust what you felt. This next part matters more than any other part of this conversation. So I need you to really stay with me here. What you felt in this relationship was real. The moments that hurt you were real. The things that confused you were real. The times you were told, directly or indirectly, that your version of events was wrong or exaggerated or unreasonable. Those were the moments you needed the most protection, and you got the least. Your gut was working correctly the whole time. The instinct that said something isn't right here, that was accurate. The feeling that said I'm not being seen clearly here, that was accurate. The sense that this keeps happening and it keeps getting minimized and I keep ending up feeling like I'm the problem, that was accurate. You weren't imagining it, you weren't being dramatic, you weren't too sensitive, you were paying attention. And the thing you were paying attention to was real. One of the most important acts of healing after a relationship with an avoidant, after any relationship where your reality was consistently undermined, is the conscious, deliberate practice of trusting yourself again. Of saying, my perception is valid, my feelings are information, my memory is reliable, I do not need external validation to confirm my own experience. That's not a small thing. For some people, rebuilding that trust in themselves is the work of years. And it starts with deciding, right now, that the voice inside you that has been asking, but was I really right about that? That voice was not asking out of genuine uncertainty. It was asking because it was taught to, and you can untrain it. The particular cruelty of unintentional gaslighting, I want to take a moment to sit with something that I think causes a lot of confusion and pain in the healing process after an avoidant relationship. And that's this. The fact that the gaslighting wasn't intentional doesn't make the recovery any easier. A lot of people in this community get stuck in this loop of, but they didn't mean to hurt me, so is it fair for me to call it gaslighting? Is it fair for me to be this affected? Isn't it manipulative to use that word when they genuinely believed what they were saying? And here's my answer to that. The word we use for what happened doesn't change what happened. Whether we call it gaslighting or emotional invalidation or avoidant projection or anything else, the experience was the same. Your reality was repeatedly minimized or denied. You stopped trusting yourself. That happened. The label is less important than your honest acknowledgement of the impact. And on the question of fairness, your recovery does not owe anything to their intentions. You don't have to downsize your healing to match the size of their awareness. Healing is about what you need, not about what they meant. And if what happened left you doubting yourself, disconnected from your instincts, unsure of your own worth, that is a real wound that deserves real attention, regardless of how it got there. You are allowed to acknowledge that you were hurt by someone who wasn't trying to hurt you. Those two things can be true at the same time. And holding both of them, without letting either one cancel the other, is actually one of the more emotionally sophisticated things you can do. They didn't mean to, and it still happened. Both are true, both matter. The other side of this, what avoidants are missing. I want to flip the lens for just a moment here, because I think it's actually worth understanding what the avoidant loses in this pattern. Not to generate compassion that lets you off the hook from your own healing, but because understanding the full picture sometimes helps things click into place. Avoidants who gaslight, consciously or not, are not just damaging their partners, they're cutting themselves off from real intimacy. Because genuine closeness requires being seen accurately. It requires two people both occupying the same reality. And if one person in a relationship is perpetually revising, minimizing, or denying the emotional reality of the other, what they end up with is not a relationship. It's a performance of a relationship, a controlled environment where things look okay because the things that aren't okay aren't allowed to be named. And the avoidant lives in that environment too. On the inside, where they've told themselves everything is fine, everything is reasonable, they're not asking too much of the other person. They are profoundly alone. Because the closeness they've managed to maintain came at the cost of reality. And reality is the only place real intimacy can actually happen. They don't see this about themselves. Most of them genuinely don't. The same mechanism that prevents them from accurately acknowledging your experience prevents them from accurately acknowledging their own. It's a loneliness they've manufactured and cannot see. And that, strangely, is one of the saddest parts of this whole thing. Not because you should stay and fix it, but because it helps you understand that their gaslighting isn't a judgment on you. It's a window into how locked off they are from themselves. How you know if you're in this pattern right now. Let me give you a quick check-in, because some of you are in the middle of this, not looking back on it, and you need to be able to see it while it's happening. You might be in a gaslighting dynamic with an avoidant right now if you spend more time defending your feelings than exploring them. If conversations about problems in the relationship consistently end with you apologizing or backing down. If you've stopped raising certain things because you already know how the conversation will go. If you regularly ask friends, "Am I being crazy?" about things that felt clear when they were happening. If you find yourself working very hard to be someone who doesn't need very much, because needing things seems to create problems. Those are not signs that you're difficult. Those are signs that you've adapted to an environment that made it costly to be human. And you deserve an environment where being human, needing things, feeling things, remembering things accurately, is not a liability. The relationship you deserve after this. I want to take a moment to talk about what comes after this. Not just leaving or healing in the abstract, but what a healthy relationship actually feels like when you've spent time in a dynamic like this. Because a lot of people who've been through this genuinely don't know anymore. The goalposts have been moved so many times that the idea of what's normal has gotten blurry. In a healthy relationship, you do not spend significant energy wondering how your partner actually feels about you. That doesn't mean everything is always communicated perfectly or that there are never misunderstandings. But there's a baseline of clarity, a baseline of confidence, that the person across from you sees you and values you and isn't secretly managing their emotional exposure at your expense. In a healthy relationship, when you bring up something that hurt you, the other person's first instinct is not to protect themselves from being seen as wrong. It's to understand what you experienced. Even if they don't fully agree with your interpretation of events, they care enough about your experience to take it seriously. They don't redirect the conversation to your tone. They don't find the exception that disproves the pattern. They stay with you in it. In a healthy relationship, you don't routinely leave difficult conversations feeling worse about yourself than when they started. You might feel drained, or sad, or in process, but not diminished. Not like you talked yourself out of something real. You deserve that. Not as a wish, not as some future reward for doing the healing work. As a baseline expectation for how you should be treated in an intimate relationship. That bar is not too high. You have been taught to think it is. It isn't. What healing from this looks like. Healing from the gaslighting patterns of an avoidant relationship doesn't look like building a case against them. It doesn't require you to decide they're a villain or that everything they said was a calculated lie. Most of it wasn't. But healing does require you to start treating your own experience as evidence, to stop dismissing what you felt because it was dismissed by someone else, to start saying out loud to yourself, if not to anyone else, I felt that, it happened, it affected me, and that is enough. I don't need their agreement to make it real. It also looks like slowly, deliberately rebuilding your tolerance for your own emotions. Learning to sit with what you feel instead of immediately questioning whether you're allowed to feel it. Learning to trust your instincts about situations and people. Learning to raise things that bother you without catastrophizing about whether raising them makes you too much. You are not too much. You were too much for someone who needed you to be less so. They didn't have to feel more. Those are very different things. And one more thing before we close. The fact that you're here, the fact that you're working through this, asking these questions, trying to understand what happened and why, that is not weakness. That is the opposite of weakness. Most people who go through what you've been through don't do this work. They just carry the confusion forward and let it shape how they show up in the next relationship and the one after that. You're choosing not to do that, and that choice matters more than you know. Keep coming back here, keep doing the work, keep trusting what you felt. The healing room is yours. Before you go, one thing to carry with you. I want to leave you with something practical, something you can actually use in the day-to-day reality of where you are right now. The next time you find yourself questioning whether what you felt was real, whether your reaction was reasonable, whether you remember incorrectly, whether you were too much or too sensitive or too demanding, I want you to do one thing before you spiral into self-doubt. Ask yourself this: if someone I love had told me this story, if a friend had come to me and described exactly what I experienced, would I have told them they were overreacting? The answer almost always is no. You would have believed them, you would have validated them. You would have been horrified or sad or angry on their behalf. You would not have turned to them and said, "Are you sure that's how it happened? You might be misremembering. You're probably being too sensitive." So why are you saying that to yourself? Your internal critic has been trained by this relationship to speak in the voice of the person who minimized you. And part of healing is recognizing that voice for what it is, borrowed doubt, and choosing to respond to yourself the way you would respond to someone you love. With belief, with validation, with the radical simplicity of what you felt was real and you deserved better. That's not bitterness, that's not victimhood, that's just the truth. And truth is where healing starts. Keep coming back here. There's more to work through, and you don't have to do it alone. The last thing, there are people who will listen to this and feel the recognition so clearly that it almost hurts. And I want to say something directly to you. If you're in this right now, if you're currently in a relationship where you regularly doubt your own perceptions, where you find yourself apologizing for feelings that were completely valid, where conversations about problems consistently end with you defending your right to have been bothered, please hear this. That is not how love is supposed to feel. Love does not require you to be constantly uncertain of where you stand. Love does not ask you to perform a smaller version of yourself to keep the peace. Love does not leave you regularly questioning your memory, your reactions, your worth. What you're experiencing is real. What it's costing you is real. And you are not obligated to stay in it because you understand why they are the way they are. Understanding someone's damage and choosing to take that damage full body on their behalf, those are different things. You understand, you've probably understood for a long time. The question now is what you're going to do with that understanding. And whatever you decide, I hope it includes choosing yourself. Loudly, unapologetically, completely. You've spent enough time in someone else's distorted reality. Come back to your own. The healing room is always open.